Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, Episode 92. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling between the 1860s and 1930. And in this episode, we will discuss the murder of a wrestler from Ohio during 1868. But first, as you can tell by the new intro, I have finally found some professional wrestling matches from the 1860s. I always knew they existed. I just had not been able to find any accounts of them. Part of the reason was because I was looking for Colonel J.H. McLaughlin, James Hiram McLaughlin, who was the first professional wrestler in the United States to make his living strictly from professional wrestling. I thought, and I think many historians think. But it's possible that his opponent in this match I found from 1869 who defeated him, Homer Lane, was actually the first wrestler to make his living from professional wrestling. Because if you search Homer Lane in the late 1860s, you get back lots of hits, lots of professional wrestling matches he had. He was friends with a gentleman named Henry Hill. And Henry Hill was what you would call a sporting man who owned a bar in New York and was the person who was frequently the one that would hold the money for all the bare knuckle prize fights. So he was there when Jem Mace fought Mike McCool. He was there when Tom Allen fought Mike McCool. He was at most of the bare knuckle prize fights in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. And although he hung around with a lot of criminals, he's one of the few people that was trusted to hold the money for these big stakes bare knuckle prize fights. And as I'm finding, some of Homer Lane's wrestling matches were for $1,000 purse, $2,000 purse, which would be $500 a side or $1,000 a side. He had to have had a reputation for honesty if he was the one that they trusted to hold the purse money. I hope to have more information about both Homer Lane and some of J.H. McLaughlin's early matches over the coming months. The Divided Championship is out now on Amazon in ebook, audiobook, paperback, and hardcover. As I had said in previous podcasts, now that this project is finished, and this was a big project, the book is about 350 pages plus endnotes. I'm going to make a second edition of St. Louis Civil War, which is a history of the St. Louis streetcar strike of 1900. And then I'm going to start back on another combat sports history project. I thought it was going to be the 10 wrestlers from the 19th century, but I may do a different project in the meantime. So keep your ears open for updates. I'm trying to finish the St. Louis history book this summer. So that's my summer project. With the Divided Championship, I hope it corrects the record. Joe Stecker did not virtually retire the championship during that 2 years and 8 months that he had the stronger claim, actually, to the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. So my aim with this book is, besides to tell a bunch of neat stories about that time period and what was going on in wrestling, and the fact that Sandow was still trying to double-cross Stecker all through the time the championship was divided, I wanted to correct the record about Joe Stecker's title reign. Most of the stuff that is out there about the title reign is wrong. And I wanted to give his career the spotlight that it deserves. He having those series of nervous breakdowns in his 40s is one of the reasons I think so many myths continue about his career. Briefly, I was just going to comment on a couple of the things going on in wrestling I haven't talked about modern wrestling for a while and probably won't talk about it very much going forward. But Alexa Bliss, who's been one of the few bright points on WWE this year, suffered a dislocated shoulder when she took I can't even call it a bad fall. Everything she did was correct as far as taking the break fall in the match she had with Kairi Sane. I mean, it happened right as the match started. It's just one of those freak things. She didn't pose. She didn't try to catch herself. She did a proper forward break fall. It was just one of those things that she was injured on a rather innocuous fall. And that can happen. You know, most people get injured because they try to post out. They try to catch themselves. They'll stick an arm out or they'll put their elbow down to try to catch themselves. And, you know, you can break a wrist, an elbow, a clavicle. She didn't do anything wrong. It's just one of those things that happens, which also brings into question why everybody's trying to kill themselves with all these high risk moves that they're doing nowadays that don't even lead to the finish. You see them on TV every single week. Nothing's very impressive anymore because it's just about all of it's been done and it's done every week repeatedly. Alexa Bliss, get well soon. You're one of the bright spots on the show, and we hope that you are healthy and that your recovery goes quickly and relatively painlessly. I just wanted to say I have not hardly watched either of the last two premium live events. Last night was Night of Champions. Oh, not Night of Champions, King of the Ring. The end of the King of the Ring tournament. And I won't give you any spoilers if you haven't seen it yet, but the first match between Orton and Cody was fantastic. I question a lot of the creative decisions after that. I will say that despite WWE kind of being on a downward trend right now, I still think Paul Levesque was the right guy to take over creative. I just think that they're on a bad string right now, and some of the decisions they're making are not helping things. And I will say that this John Cena heel run has been a complete bomb. The fans didn't want it. I do want to say one thing though. They announcers keep calling him the GOAT. Triple H keeps calling him the GOAT. The fact that John Cena is considered the GOAT is absolutely laughable. Nothing against John Cena. If you want to say John Cena is the GOAT when it comes to Make-A-Wish, he absolutely is, and he deserves all the credit in the world and all the kudos that go along with that. He is. There's no one that's done as many Make-A-Wishes as him, and he should be lauded for that. But when you talk about the greatest wrestler in WWF, WWF, or WWE is between three people. Bruno Sammartino, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. Hulk Hogan, who I have no respect for, and didn't in the 80s. So I'm not new to this. I was booing the bum in the 1986. And then Stone Cold Steve Austin, who helped the company go public. For me, Stone Cold was one of my favorite wrestlers. I don't know if I would call him the GOAT. I would probably lean Bruno just because he was doing it in an era where there was a lot less mass media. There was no internet. It was much harder to do what he was doing with basically TV and newspaper ads. And he sold out the Garden an incredible amount of times. So I would lean Bruno. You can't knock what Hogan did to take the company national, but Stone Cold made more money than anybody, and he's the reason the company went public. So those are the three. John Cena, he's probably in the top 10, but to say he is the GOAT is laughable. And he was never the GOAT in the ring. And now, pushing 50, he is nowhere near what he once was. And he's being very, very cautious, which is making his matches even harder to slog through. So I think this was a huge mistake all the way around. I think it's hurt. Good news, though, is he'll probably drop the title to Cody here. My guess is SummerSlam, but it could be Survivor Series. But stay tuned. He'll drop that belt back to Cody. And then finally, we're going to be going to the summer schedule here next month. So starting next month, the podcast will come out on the 1st and 3rd Mondays of the month, except for September when we have 5 Mondays. Then it'll be out the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th. After that, we may go back to a more frequent posting schedule. But in the summertime, because I'm in graduate medical education, we are recruiting for next year's fellowship class. So that's 5 interview days. I've got the onboarding of my new fellows coming in this year. I've got the offboarding of my graduating fellows. And almost all the accreditation tasks for the fellowship occur in the summer. So I don't take vacation during the summer. I actually did not work at all this weekend. I've had graduations the last 3 weekends, and I know I'm getting behind, so I have to get back onto it. So I'm very, very busy during the summer. So we have to go to the less frequent schedule of every other week. In October, that may change again. And let's jump into the main content of the show for this week. So while I was finding the matches with J.H. McLaughlin and Homer Lane, I came across probably one of the earliest examples of a suspected work match and the tragic outcome related to it. So during June of 1868, a Cincinnati professional wrestler by the name of Uriel Pickett traveled to Hamilton, Ohio. So Hamilton is like in the suburbs of Cincinnati. It's in Butler County, but it's considered part of the Cincinnati greater metropolitan area, and I think parts of Cincinnati might be in Butler County as well. But so this is not far. This is in the same locale. The wrestler that he's going to wrestle, Uriel Pickett, is going to wrestle a local Hamilton wrestler named Tim Waller. And Pickett, in hyping up this match, tells people he is a champion and he's going to defend his championship against Waller. And I guess he was convincing enough that most of the local sporting men bet their money on Pickett being the winner. And remember, in these matches, you could have the winner, you could have first fall, you could have quickest fall. Well, apparently Waller threw Pickett pretty easily, leading to a huge loss of money for the gamblers. The gamblers suspected that Pickett was working with Waller, and this had all been a setup to get a hold of the gambling money, which was the number one reason prior to the promotional system being created why people would work matches, was because to manipulate the gambling and to maximize the gambling profits for the wrestlers and the managers, backers, anybody that was involved with it. So Pickett, in showing no sense whatsoever, a complete lack of ability to read the room, decides that after this match, he is going to travel to the local inn with the sporting men. So he goes for drinks at the Hole in the Wall bar in Hamilton. And Pickett is drinking with 3 local men, John Griffin, Joseph Kelly, and George Shedd, who, by the way, all lost sizable amounts of money on this match. The men were angry with Pickett, but drank with him anyway. And as I said, Pickett should have been concerned, but seemed oblivious to the danger. So I've talked about in the past, in the 1890s, when Martin Farmer Burns was the American Heavyweight Wrestling Champion, that he and a frequent opponent of his, D.A. McMillan, pulled a scam on a couple of small towns in Minnesota. D.A. McMillan gets into town a few days before Farmer Burns is set to arrive and impresses all the locals with what a loudmouth he is. Bets people that he can win foot races and loses a foot race. Bets people he can do this. Bets people he can do that. And he always loses those small bets in the beginning. When Burns gets to town, McMillan challenges Burns to a wrestling match. Burns agrees to it. Now, you have to wonder how smart the townspeople were, because why would the American Heavyweight Wrestling Champion accept a challenge from somebody he's never seen, doesn't know, in this small Minnesota town, presumably risking his title against the person. It doesn't make any sense. But he had done such a good job impressing the locals with what a doofus he was that they all thought, oh, we are going to mop up betting on Burns over this idiot. Well, of course, the idiot was the one who was pulling the wool over their eyes, and he won the quickest fall and the first fall. Of course, Burns won the match because, presumably, or at least in theory, that's what they told the people. He was defending his championship, so he was going to win the match. But the match went all 5 falls. When McMillan won the first fall, they were like, oh, well, Burns is definitely going to win the quickest fall because Burns was mad. Burns beats him 2 straight falls. So now Burns is up. Yeah, Burns is up 2 falls to 1. So now the locals are like, oh yeah, the fans who are there watching are like, oh now we got him. Burns is going to kill him. So Burns's third fall was really really quick. So they bet Burns is going to have quickest fall because it's going to have to go at least 4 falls before you know that. So all the money comes in on Burns for the quickest fall. And wouldn't you know, McMillan comes out and by some fluke trips Burns and Burns gets pinned quicker than he pinned McMillan in the third fall. They come back out, they wrestle like a minute because they have to wrestle longer than what McMillan pinned Burns in the first fall, but it's 10 seconds longer. Pins him, and the two of them get out of town on a train because they don't want to be around when the locals realize they've been duped, which they did at the match anyway, because they chased him to the train station. But they get on the train, they get out of town. Pickett should have done the exact same thing. Instead, he goes to the local bar and starts drinking with the people that he might have been. We don't know that this was a work match. Everybody suspects it, but he's out drinking with them. Next morning, 4 men carry the lifeless body of Pickett from the bar. Someone had shot him in the back of the head. The police get involved, and pretty quickly suspicions fall on Joseph Kelly for the murder. But Joseph Kelly does what many people do in that situation, and he turns state's evidence, and in return for the prosecution dropping any charges against him, he identifies Griffin as the shooter. Griffin protests his innocence, but the jury finds him guilty of killing Pickett, and the judge sentences Griffin to death. This is one of the things why I've never been all that crazy about the death penalty, is because you can have cases like this where the only evidence saying someone killed someone is from the mouth of someone who just as easily could have been the one to pull the trigger and could be the guilty one. It's so hard to take somebody's life based on the word of another criminal who had as much motivation and may have done the deed as the person that was convicted. Griffin appeals to the Ohio Supreme Court, but they uphold the conviction. And in 1868, they issue the first death warrant for Butler County. So no one had ever been executed in Butler County prior to this the murder of this professional wrestler. Griffin's friend and family petitioned the governor for commutation or pardon, but were not hopeful that the governor would grant the petition. And Griffin continued to protest his innocence. And unfortunately, I never did find whether he was released or the sentence was commuted. In many of these cases, it's much quicker than it is today. You're talking normally 2 to 3 years for all the appeals to be exhausted, as opposed to 10 to 20 years of today. But it's not unusual for these cases to stretch out another year after the death warrant has been issued. That was it for the main history topic this week. But I thought that was I haven't heard the murder of too many professional wrestlers, but there's plenty of motivation for doing that around these gambling schemes. Burns and McMillan were smart enough to get out of town. A lot of the people around sporting events, there were some organized crime elements. You did have the Irish gangs that controlled New York around this time. Henry Hill knew a lot of Henry Hill. I keep calling him Henry Hill. That was the guy from Goodfellas. Harry Hill. Harry Hill was the local sporting man that owned the bar and was friends with Homer Lane. There are rough elements around both professional prize fighting and then professional glove boxing and professional wrestling. One thing I didn't realize is how popular collar and elbow wrestling was in the 1860s. That was the dominant style at first. Then Greco-Roman became the dominant style in the mid 1870s, going into the 1880s, although all of those multiple styles of wrestling were around up until the 20th century. You still had collar and elbow contests and Cornish wrestling, which was a version of collar and elbow, and Cumberland and side hold and back hold. But the main styles were still Greco-Roman, collar and elbow, and then catch as catch can, catch wrestling, which is the submission wrestling. All of the wrestling you see today, even though it doesn't look that much like it, is a all derived from catch wrestling. Catch becomes the dominant style in the 1890s, and catch wrestling is, even today, what you see in the ring is a gymnasticized, poor community theater version of catch wrestling. My recommendation for this week, I actually have one that I didn't write down. The name of this book is I Hear You Paint Houses by Charles Brandt. And it is the confessions of Frank the Irishman Sheeran, who was suspected of being the one to have killed Jimmy Hoffa because he and Jimmy Hoffa were really good friends. And while that seems odd, a lot of times in those situations, organized crime would have a friend be the one to commit the murder because they are the few people that can get close enough to the person they're trying to kill to actually be able to pull that off. Number two, you would say, well, why would they go out and kill their friend? Because it's a way to ensure their survival. If they go out and they kill their friend, the people that ordered the person's death are going to feel that, one, you've got a lot to lose if it comes out because you're facing the possible death penalty. But two, that you're going to follow orders no matter what your relationship is with the person that you killed. He goes into a lot of mob history because he was around it for 30 or 40 years. He talks a lot about things. They touch a little bit on the Bay of Pigs. They touch a little bit on Dallas in November of 1963. But the big crux, the focus of the book is on Jimmy Hoffa, his disappearance, and Frank Sheeran's relationship with Jimmy Hoffa. I thought it was a pretty good read. And then my other recommendation this week is the episode on Lou Thesz as part of the NWA Championship Series on the Shut Up and Wrestle podcast with Brian R. Solomon. The episode on Lou Thesz was a gentleman named Mark Fleming, who Lou Thesz had trained, talking about Lou. And besides finding it just interesting, and for me, growing up in St. Louis, Lou Thesz he would be number one on Mount Rushmore in St. Louis for wrestling. Lou's best days were way behind him in the late 70s when I discovered wrestling, but I still knew about him because they talked about him on the show, Wrestling at the Chase, probably every couple weeks, and all of the exploits that Lou had accomplished. And the review is based on what I was hearing on this podcast. Mark Fleming shared that Lou Thesz didn't think much of Ruffy Silverstein. And Ruffy Silverstein had been a NCAA champion in 1936, was a legitimate wrestler, and seemed like he would be the kind of guy that Lou Thesz really gravitated towards. But Lou Thesz couldn't stand him, according to Mark Fleming. And there is a match out there on the web from St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 1950, which is the second match that they had, because they referenced the first match during the broadcast. There's another one that says it's from 1951, but it's the same match from 1950. So I'll have a link on the up there on the show notes at kenzimmermanjr.com/episode 92. And I'll have links on anything we've talked about in the show notes that there's a link for. But I watched this match, it's a 2 out of 3 falls match that goes about 27 minutes because, of course, they cut the intermissions out. So you're only getting a truncated version of the intermissions. But it was the match, all the action in the match occurred in about 23, 24 minutes. And it looks like they were hitting each other pretty good. But I didn't see anything unprofessional. I didn't see where they quit working with each other. It wasn't like a Nia Jax, Charlotte Flair situation where they just quit in the middle of the match cooperating with each other and had a brawl and then kind of got back on track. They were wrestling and working with each other the whole time. But it looked like they were getting a little stiff on the strikes. And at one time, I think Silverstein hit Lou pretty good along the ropes, and it stunned Lou, and Silverstein backed off because he didn't realize he had hit him that hard. So that was a little odd spot. But other than that, I really couldn't see where they were having that much problem with each other. But the one thing I will say was the ending was odd, the third fall. So Lou catches him with the Lou Thesz press coming off the rope and goes for the pin, which is, I'm sure, the agreed upon finish. And when the referee gets to 3, Silverstein raises his shoulder right at the 3 count. I mean, right at the 3 count. To the point where it looks like Lou thought that he didn't pin him and was like, what's going on? And slammed him back down to pin him. But the referee's patting him on the back. No, the pin's over. Because I don't know if the referee was like, that was odd, but, my hand hit the ground for 3, it's over. But Lou sat on him and talked to him for about 10 or 15 seconds before he got off. And I'm wondering if that's what made him mad, was he was trying to kick out right at the 3 count instead of letting Lou clearly pin him. Other than that, I couldn't see where there was a whole lot of animosity. They just might not like each other. There's just people you don't get along with and people you don't like. So even though it seems like that they would have a lot in common, he just didn't care for him. Now, he said, Mark Fleming said, he didn't have any personal issues with Vern Gagne at all. The reason he wouldn't drop the title to Vern is he thought Vern was too small. He thought Vern was a light heavyweight and that it would not look right for Thesz at 230 pounds to be dropping the title to someone around 200 pounds. That was the issue with Vern. It wasn't that he disliked Vern. He actually liked Vern and had a lot of respect for him. That's it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. KenZimmermanJr.com is the place to check out the show notes for today's episode. And you can view the show notes at KenZimmermanJr.com/episode 92. At KenZimmermanJr.com, you can also see the things I'm currently working on, the list of books I've already written. And as I've said before, the website is still in construction. It'll probably be another month or two before it's fully back to normal. But I'm very glad that I made the switch that I made. So there's no regrets there. And I'd also be grateful if you'd rate this podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. That helps tremendously with keeping the podcast visible so people who've never heard of it can discover it. And if you've already done that, thank you so much. I have to say a special thank you to my son, who shares every episode on his one of his social platforms. And his tagline for me is the old boar, which I like because one of my favorite shows is Vikings, and one of my favorite, I guess, lines in the show is there was always the belief amongst everybody that Ragnar was never going to be killed by any Viking because Ragnar had 5 sons, And in real life, two of them were already famous warriors, but in the show, one is already a famous warrior, Bjorn Ironside. One of his other sons, Ivor the Boneless, is a military genius. And in the show, Ragnar always said, "How the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar has suffered." And what he was saying is, whoever was foolish enough to kill him, that his sons would take revenge and take revenge brutally. In both real life and in the show, Ragnar is killed by King Aela of Northumbria, and he's thrown into a pit of poisonous snakes. But when Aela is torturing him before he's going to throw him into the pit, Ragnar tells him how the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. And when his sons come to get revenge and they're dragging Aela off to the place they're going to execute him, Aela tries to bribe them to let him go with gold and silver. And Bjorn looks at him and tells him the same thing Ragnar had told him. "Oh, how the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered." So I always liked that. Yeah, strong family bond and, that warrior ethos. But the one thing I was thinking of is, Ragnar is looking pretty old in that show. How old does Trey think that I look? But I guess I had to take the good with the bad and just be appreciative that he finds value in the show and is kind enough to share it on his socials. So thanks everybody else who has done the same thing, and I will see you all next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.